All right, good afternoon. This is Chris Avila. I'm with the Waco MPO, the director, and we'll be beginning momentarily with this presentation of the draft Unified Planning Work Program for fiscal years 2022 and 2023. We're going to give folks just a minute or two to log on here, and we are recording this for folks to be able to log in later if they're not able to attend one of our public informational meetings. So stand by, we will begin momentarily. All right, well, good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started with this public informational meeting on our Unified Planning Work Program draft document that the MPO staff has prepared for the next 2 fiscal years. And what we're going to do here, before we get into what this document is, we're going to just do a quick review of what the Metropolitan Planning Organization is and what role we play. Then we'll review the document itself and what we're proposing in that document for the next 2 fiscal years. We'll wrap up by giving you an opportunity to provide us your feedback on what you think is appropriate, or maybe what sort of things ought to be included in this document, and your opportunities to provide further comments later on. So real quick, the MPO is a federally required organization to provide input into regional transportation decision making. It involves our local elected leaders, as well as you, the people that we represent on this as part of this process. The MPO is intended to prioritize which transportation projects are the most important and identify realistic funding strategies for those priorities. And fundamentally, our role is to let local elected leaders identify how federal highway and public transportation dollars are to be used within this region. And ultimately, what we hope to have is a transportation network that is consistent with what our region wants it to look like and how it ought to function in the future. MPOs are required for all urbanized areas with more than 50,000 people. Within the state of Texas, there are actually 23 MPOs that meet this criteria. Our MPO covers all of McLennan County and is governed by a 20-member policy board, which is composed of elected leaders from each of our cities, as well as McLennan County, and also has a representative from the Waco district of the Texas Department of Transportation. That policy board is informed by a 36-member technical committee, which includes all of the various transportation modal interests within the region, such as TxDOT or Waco Transit or Waco Regional Airport. It also includes professional planners and engineers from each of our member communities, and as well as other important stakeholders in the transportation planning process. A very generic description of the transportation planning process is found on this particular slide. It represents something of a funnel where we consider ideas, concepts, recommendations from our stakeholders and citizens. And at the very top, we then evaluate those concepts and project ideas based on an evaluation of need and whether we can afford those projects. And the ones that make that cut are included in our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which looks out 25 years into the future. Those projects are further refined based on the highest priorities that are identified through the development of that plan into a short-range plan. And these represent the priorities that our policy board wishes to pursue over the next 10 years. At that point, we then ask those who have implementing authority, such as TxDOT or the City of Waco or Waco Transit, to begin the project development process. That includes things like design, engineering, environmental review, right-of-way acquisition. And once those projects are ready to go, we start having the conversation about commitment of funding to actually implement the project. That's when we talk about our transportation improvement program. And once a project is included in that document, we then have a timeline for implementation. This is sometimes referred to as the point when bulldozers start showing up, but it can be the establishment of a service, such as a public transportation service. One of the things you might have noticed is that there isn't a specific reference to the Unified Planning Work Program, which is what we're talking about today. This actually fits a little bit above that process and identifies the work tasks that the MPO staff will be working on over the next 2 fiscal years. Now, that can include special studies such as corridor studies or other types of modal studies like a transit study. And oftentimes there are recommendations that come out of that work, and that feeds into the very top of the funnel. So right now, we're currently operating under a work program that runs through the end of September of this year. And so the new work program will begin on October 1st. At the core of this requirement is identifying how federal highway and public transportation planning funds are to be used during this 2-year time frame. The MPO receives an amount of money for planning activities from both the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Administration. But Waco Transit also receives funds from FTA for their planning purposes as well. So we'll be walking through each of those as part of this presentation. And then also, part of the requirement here is that not only do we identify what we're going to be working on, but also identify how much we think it's going to cost to accomplish those tasks. Now, there's a separate process at the very end of all this called our annual performance and expenditure report, and that identifies the work that we actually accomplished as an MPO and how much money did we actually spend. We have a similar report for that for the fiscal year 2020, which was just completed back in September. And if you have an interest in seeing what we actually accomplished in fiscal year 2020, let us know and we'll get you a copy of that report. So let's start walking through what is in the draft document and being proposed for the next 2 fiscal years. There are 5 overarching tasks that form this work program, and underneath that are a number of subtasks. So the first task is our administrative tasks, the daily activities of the MPO. So this includes everything from purchasing supplies such as a pack of pencils to training of staff to ensuring that we conduct regular policy board and technical committee meetings. And this is anticipated to be a 2-year cost just under $250,000. These costs tend to be pretty even between the fiscal years. So if you divide that cost by 2, you get a pretty good idea of what the annual expenditures for administrative tasks are for the MPO. The second task is referred to as data management. There are a number of data sets that the MPO either manages directly or performs analysis with to provide recommendations to our policymakers and to our technical committee. What we've got identified on this slide is just a small sample of the data that we manage on a regular basis. It includes everything from demographic data, since transportation is fundamentally getting from point A to point B. We'd like to know what the point A's are and what the point B's are and how those might be changing. But we're also interested in things like crashes and the condition of our existing transportation system. How reliable is the system? What kind of congestion issues might we have? And that all fits within this particular data task. And as you can see, data can be quite expensive. So we're expecting to spend a little over $260,000 over the next 2 years managing the various data sets we need to run our analysis. Task 3 represents short-range planning. As a general rule, these are things that have a time frame within the next 5 to 10 years. The most important part of this is development of our transportation improvement program, which identifies the projects that are ready to be implemented over the next 4 years. We are currently under a program that runs through fiscal year 2024. And so occasionally that program needs to be amended. And so that's one of the subtasks underneath underneath short-range planning. But under state statute, we are required to update that every 2 years within the state of Texas. And so we'll be developing a new tip very shortly. In fact, we'll start looking at candidate projects for that new tip this fall, probably in the December timeframe. We're also going to be doing a review of our highway functional classification system. That is a hierarchy that all roads within the region are identified as how they function. And it does have some relevance to the eligibility for whether a roadway is eligible for federal dollars. And that review is conducted once a decade and is done in coordination with TxDOT and the Federal Highway Administration. And this is, fiscal year 22 is the year for that review. And so you also see that there are some other tasks that the MPO staff will be assisting with. Public transportation coordination is one of them. And we do occasional reviews of air quality just to make sure that we remain in compliance with EPA standards for various pollutants, of which transportation is a significant contributor to some of those pollutants. So the MPO is anticipating that from our dollars, a little over $300,000 is what these various tasks will probably cost over the next 2 years. But there are also a number of Waco Transit tasks also identified here. A lot of them are related to evaluation of their system, both their fixed route system as well as their demand response system, and to make sure that that system is being responsive to the needs of those that they serve. It also identifies several activities designed to make that system easier for the people who use transit to be able to use their system. And so there's another a little over 300,000 that Waco Transit will be spending over the next 2 years on these various tasks. So when you put that together, it's about a little less than $620,000 over the next 2 years for the combined MPO and Waco Transit activities. Task 4 is long-range planning. This includes our Metropolitan Transportation Plan. Now that plan was adopted in January of last year. And so right now we're kind of in an in-between period where we're looking at whether there are any modifications appropriate that were just not on our radar screen when we adopted that plan. And being that that was pre-pandemic, there are several. And so we do anticipate that there will probably be at least 1 or 2 amendments during the life of this work program that will have to be processed through the MPO, through the transportation planning process. We're also looking at a update of the Regional Thoroughfare Plan. This is a document that we use, one, to help out our member governments, but also to identify where new thoroughfares may be appropriate and what the conceptual design of those thoroughfares ought to look like. There have been some updates within the last 2 years from some of our member governments. And also, since we're looking at an update to the highway functional classification system, an update to this thoroughfare plan is appropriate during this 2-year cycle. And then we have an active transportation plan, which was adopted about a little over 2 years ago now. And so it's also an appropriate time to look at an update to that plan as well towards the latter half of fiscal year 23. And so the 2-year cost for this task is a little over $267,000. And then the final overarching task that's part of this program is what we call special studies. This is often where we have corridor studies, or in this case, we have a study of Waco Transit's fixed route system that actually is going to start later this fiscal year, but is going to carry over into fiscal year 22. And so we want to recognize that cost for the next fiscal year. And it's a $300,000 study, but as we can see, you can see here, we estimate that probably about 75 to 80% of that cost is probably going to occur actually in the next fiscal year. This is a jointly funded project by the MPO and Waco Transit, and the MPO share, at least for the next fiscal year, is $90,000, and for Waco Transit is $150,000, which is a mix of federal and non-federal dollars. So when we put everything together here for MPO tasks, Waco Transit tasks, the amount that Waco Transit is using to match their federal dollars, it totals up to about $1.6 million over the 2-year period. Pardon me for that. Now, one of the questions we sometimes have to address is, how are the MPO dollars, which are federal dollars and also have a match requirement, how are those being matched? So statewide, those are being matched through what are called transportation development credits. Those are credits the state of Texas receives for the fact that they have chosen to build part of their highway network using toll revenue. And so the federal government gives the state a credit for the amount of federal dollars that would have been used otherwise, which are now being used through an alternative funding mechanism. And the state is allowed to effectively waive the match requirement for projects that those credits are applied to. And the state of Texas has chosen to apply part of their transportation development credits to the funds that the MPOs receive for planning purposes. So this actually is a big help to our process. All right, so our public process here is we have a 30-day comment period, which will run through June 2nd. This will give us some time to be able to review any comments that we receive as part of this process and to make any appropriate changes prior to presenting this to the policy board for adoption. Today are our public informational meetings, but this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the MPO website for folks to view afterwards in case they were not able to attend one of the meetings today. On June 3rd, the MPO Technical Committee will do a review of this draft document and make their recommendations. And then we'll have a formal public hearing, excuse me. We'll have a formal public hearing, pardon me, Apologize for that. We'll have a formal public hearing in advance of policy or adoption, which is scheduled for June 17th. Both the Tech Committee and Policy Board meetings are going to be virtual for the month of June. And so if you wish to be part of the public hearing in front of the Policy Board, we do ask that you register in advance for that meeting. And the deadline for that will be 10 a.m. on June 17th, if you wish to speak. So with that, the MPO policy is we are very flexible on how you provide any comments if you wish to provide those to us. If you have any questions, we also ask that you reach out to us. And on here are several methods, but we, sorry, got a little frog in my throat, perfect timing. And, but any method that you can use to reach out to us is considered acceptable. So that is our presentation today. I'd like to open up to see if there are any questions or any comments that anyone might have. And right now, it doesn't appear that we have any questions or comments, but again, we'll have another public informational meeting at 5:30 this evening. So if you know of anyone that wishes to participate, please let them know of that time. And as always, if you have something that you want to ask later on, feel free to reach out to staff at your convenience. So we thank you for attending this public informational meetings. And again, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to reach out to us at one of these methods that we have posted here today. So we thank you and wish you a good rest of your afternoon.